Heather Darby is an agronomic and soil specialist for the University of Vermont Extension. She was raised on a dairy farm in Northwest Vermont. This practical experience, complemented by her education, has focused her attention on sustainable and regenerative agriculture and promotion of environmental stewardship of the land. Darby's outreach and research programs have focused on delivering practical on-farm education in the areas of soil health, nutrient management, forage production, and pasture management. Heather also operates a diversified certified organic farm with her husband, Ron Herman. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Heather. She's going to kick us off today with some information about understanding and interpreting soil health test results.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Looks like everything is working. Correct?
Looks good on our side, Heather.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me today. And I'm excited to talk with you a bit today about soil tests, specifically sort of standard fertility analysis or standard soil tests that most farmers, I would say, have and are in the habit, hopefully, of taking and are used to hearing about and hopefully seeing these tests as well. And I hope you are too. And of course, soil testing is really critical to understand the fertility aspects of your soil. And it's really kind of a starting point to understand where to look when somebody is asking you what should they do for fertility on their fields. At least myself, working in extension, I get a lot of calls from people that are unhappy, maybe with their crop production, with their pastures, with the amount of productivity that they're seeing. And immediately they want to either reseed something to get rid of the weeds or whatever might be happening, or they want you to tell them what to put on the soil. And it is not something that you can really give advice on without having a soil test. And so it's kind of a joke within extension to tell the farmers, it's not a joke, it's real, but usually when a farmer asks you a question, the first thing you say is, do you have a soil test? And it really is true. It's very useful and gives you a lot of insight to what's happening in that field. I will say that soil tests are just a part of the conversation. They are a piece of information, a really important piece of information, but it's not the only information that you need to be able to work with a farmer to develop a fertility management strategy or program for their farm. But it is a critical piece. So this is a UVM soil test report, a newer one. You'll be seeing some older ones. I'm sure some folks got some laughs out of those this morning, seeing some of the old soil tests. But I wanted to just take the time this morning to walk through a soil test. A lot of folks that work with farmers don't necessarily have a good understanding of what's on a soil test, what it means, and what it can tell you. And a lot of times they can be really overwhelming, not just to a service provider that may not have that expertise, but also to the farmer that may have a handful of these and they're not even sure what to do with them all. So let's just walk through that for our first 20 minutes together, and then we're going to take some time in the breakout session to look at soil tests and kind of get a sense of what you think is going on when you look at them. All right, so again, this is a UVM soil test, and some advice that I would give after doing a lot of these and working on this for a while is to make sure that the farmers are trying to take soil tests somewhat regularly, right? So it doesn't have to be every year. Certainly that actually doesn't make all that much sense. but we recommend every 3 years. And the reason for taking a soil test every 3 years is that if you actually implement the recommendations that are on the test, then theoretically that should be changing the way the soil test looks, right? So the way the nutrient levels of the soil itself. So it takes about 3 years to see that change if you're following the soil test. Now, if you're doing something really drastic or really trying to make some significant changes quickly, then I would suggest that you take a soil test probably every year so that you can monitor what you're doing. And another time that you would take soil tests is when you're rotating crops and you want to make sure whatever crop you're rotating into is being fertilized properly, or, you know, if a crop has special nutrient needs, that you're able to meet those and understand what, again, is happening in your soil. And as far as timing, you know, it doesn't necessarily matter when you take the soil test, but, you know, it's generally, I guess, more, I wouldn't say advantageous, but more flexibility, I guess, when farmers are taking soil tests in the fall. So taking soil tests in the fall, usually the nutrient levels are kind of drawn down across the season, but not just that, you're able to get the soil test submitted possibly to the lab and get some information back and be able to make a plan for the next season. So again, there's no bad time to take a soil test, really. It's when you have time to do it, and just taking it is half the battle. But I often recommend the fall so that you have time to make a plan over the winter. Again, you really need to consider what crop you're growing as well, and if you're rotating. All right. You know, we get a lot of questions around depth of soil testing, and you know, usually a standard soil probe is about 1 foot deep. And for most farmers that I work with, I just have them take it to 1 foot. It's a lot easier than trying to take it to 6 inches or 4 inches, which are some of the recommendations for pasture. And, you know, it just makes it a little more complicated, especially if a farmer's trying to take the test. So normally I just say to, you know, take it to the full depth of the probe. It makes it a lot easier for everybody. I also think you can run into some errors if you're trying to, you know, take a core that's 12 inches and then you start sort of cutting that. You can just end up kind of making, skewing your soil test a bit. All right, using a probe is really, really important. You don't need a lot of soil for a soil test, as you probably noticed. It's like a cup, a half a cup. It's not very much. So doing a really good job walking the field is important, and getting a representative sample. And if you're using a shovel, you may be going to inconsistent depths, and then you're also collecting a lot of soil that you don't need. So definitely using a soil probe is best. And, you know, getting a decent one is important. It makes your life a lot easier. A decent probe costs over $100, but it's definitely worth it if you're going to do any number of soil samples. Most of the states in New England have soil test labs, or they utilize soil test labs that are available in the region. So as an example, UVM no longer does their own soil test analysis in-house. They actually send their samples out to the University of Maine. And I know other schools have consolidated like that as well. The most important piece is that you know the recommended soil extractant for your state. And for most New England states, or most of the Northeast, that's either a Morgan's extractant or a modified Morgan's extractant. And that's really important because those extractants that are used have been developed and really settled upon by soil scientists here in the Northeast to be suitable for the types of soils that we have. So sometimes if you're taking your samples and you want to send them out of state or out of the region to the Midwest, you may see some analysis like Olson or Bray 1 or Bray 3. And if you send it to those labs, you'll get results back. And not that they're not good results, they're just not always that meaningful for the soil types that we have here. And it also will make it difficult to interpret the results in a meaningful way for the farm and the soil types that we have here again in the Northeast. So I recommend using a local lab, being very consistent. You know, once you find the lab that you like, that's again a reputable lab, you'll want to stick with it because you'll want to be comparing your soil tests over time. And if you're kind of moving from lab to lab, things can be slightly different. Some of the analyticals can be a little bit different, like the organic matter measurement as example, or maybe how somebody measures soil pH or how they report their results. So we have great labs in the Northeast, and we've had wonderful soil scientists over the years developing meaningful analytics that we can use to develop really good recommendations for the farmers that we work with. Okay, so when you take a soil test, usually there's some piece of paper you need to fill out that asks you a bunch of questions, and answering the questions is really, really important in being accurate, especially if you want nutrient recommendations. If you're not making your own nutrient recommendations and you don't really know how to do that or have the capabilities to do it or even the information, and you want that information from the lab, you need to give them the information that they ask for, right? And some labs, you know, will allow you to get recommendations for multiple crops. So if you're not sure what you're doing, you know, just put down the crops you think you might grow so that you actually get recommendations, let's say for pasture, maybe for a hay field, maybe for corn or soybeans or whatever it is that you're growing. But what you really need to know is that the recommendations differ depending on the crop, right? So you can see on this particular soil test down on the bottom, it says recommendations for oats, rye, wheat, triticale, and millet, which apparently was something I chose for this example soil test. But the recommendation for pasture is going to be different. Okay, it's not going to be the same as this. So that's just something to know. So if you are looking at a farmer's soil test and you see that it says they're growing corn, but there's actually pasture in that field, you're going to want to make a new recommendation. You are not going to want to use that one because it will be different. All right. Okay. So taking the soil test, we talked about that, the timing, how often, all those things are really important, and filling out the form as well. All those things help to inform the lab and also the results that you will get back. So as an example, at UVM anyway, and most every other lab as well, you're not going to see nitrogen reported in the analytics. But as you can see down below, you do get a nitrogen recommendation. Now, where does that come from? You know, in the UVM soil analytics and recommendations, it's estimated. It's estimated based on the drainage class of the soil. So if they ask you that on the form, you're going to want to write that down. It's estimated by the yields you think you're going to get and obtain and the crop that you're going to grow. And sometimes the pH of the soil or the organic matter level. Okay, so again, especially in regards to nitrogen, where the recommendations are coming from information that you provide, not necessarily 100% from the analysis. it's really important to fill out that form. Okay, so let's look at the results here and make our way down the test. Now, UVM and other labs too, I've seen this on the Agri 1 or Dairy 1 test results too, and I believe Massachusetts also offers this table that you see at the top, which for most of the farmers and myself too, it's, you know, the go-to. It's colorful, it's a chart, it's easy to interpret. And so right away, when you look at this graph on the top, you can see phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. So 3 of the macronutrients. And then you see this scale, low, medium, optimum, high, or excessive. And easy enough, right? You look at this and you immediately know that the phosphorus is in the medium range, potassium is in the medium range, and the magnesium's in this sort of high or excessive range. And that feels good. You kind of know something right away, and it feels easy to interpret. Now, of course, different labs have different ranges. So I think UMass has a very low, and they have high, and then maybe they have excessive. And so labs will differ in that scale, but usually most of them have this sort of graphical presentation so that you can see where the nutrients in your soil are falling. So what does low, medium, optimum, high, or excessive mean? Now, really, this again is also pretty straightforward. If you have low or very low soil test nutrient levels, it essentially says that the chance of seeing a crop response if you add the required amount of nutrient is really high, okay? So the levels of that nutrient are so low that if you add that nutrient, you're highly likely to see a crop response, okay? Now, if they're in the medium category, you are likely to see a response, okay? And if you're in the optimum category, it means that you may or may not see a response from adding more nutrient, okay? Once you get into the optimum range, really at that point, there should be enough of that nutrient to supply the crop that you are growing. So in the immediate term, you probably don't really need to add more. But as you would imagine, right, if over 3 years' time, you're not adding any more because the soil test says, it's optimum, you don't really need anything for this crop. In 3 years' time, you will be drawing down those nutrients. And when you go back out and take your soil test, you may see that you were in optimum and now maybe you're in medium, okay? Because crops are removing nutrients. So just because it's an optimum doesn't mean that you ignore it forever. But if you are limited in resources to buy fertility, let's say, or you're limited in manure that you might have on your farm, you may choose to put that fertility on a soil or on a field that's low in nutrients. You're more likely to see a crop response, and clearly that field needs it more. But again, that's the point of continuing to take soil tests so that you don't move from optimum to low, and then all of a sudden need lots of nutrients to be able to support the crop. Now, once you get in high or excessive, you know, adding more nutrient, the potential to see a crop response is pretty low. And it also could continue, right, to increase those nutrient levels. And that can be detrimental both to the environment, but in some cases also to the crops. There can be negative impacts as well, right? So again, it's pretty straightforward, probably much of what you thought it was, right? Low, medium, optimum, high, or excessive, or whatever that range is. If you're low, you're likely going to see a crop response if you add the recommended nutrients. And once you start to move up that scale, the chance of response becomes less and less. But this can also help you as a farmer or consultant really start to categorize fields on a farm, like which fields really need some tender loving care and which fields are going to be okay for a year, or maybe I just need to add a little more to maintain those levels. And that's really what that graph is showing you. Okay, so let's go down to the actual numbers, this table. There's a lot going on here. And right at the top, it gives us the soil pH. And you can see this says 2-to-1 water. Sometimes it'll say 1-to-1 water. pH can be reported in different ways. So, you definitely want to make sure that, again, a local lab is going to give you results that are, conducive for our area. So you don't really have to worry about, interpreting it wrong. So in this case, the soil pH, again, is showing the level of acidity in the soil. And so 7 is basic, is neutral. Sorry, 7 is neutral. Anything below 7 is acidic, and anything above 7 is basic. And, we've all learned that in grade school, really, what acidity is and what things are acidic and when they're not. So we really want the soil for most crops to be slightly acidic. So what's slightly acidic? Well, ideally for most crops, we're talking about somewhere between 6.5 and 6.8 pH. Now, when we start to get into more acidity or more basic or alkalinity, we can run into some issues with our crops. And I will talk about that here in more detail. I feel like most people have seen this. If you've taken a basic soil science class or heard me speak before, you have seen this graph. And it really just hits home that nutrients in the soil are highly impacted by the soil pH, okay? So you can see that most of our macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium, are mostly available when the soil is slightly acidic to slightly alkaline, right? And you can see the more acidic the soil gets, the less phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, all of those nutrients become, right? The less available they become. So if you're not growing crops in this sort of optimum range we were talking about, then really you're tying up nutrients or minimizing their ability to actually cycle in the soil and become available to your crops. Okay, so they might be there, but they're not available to the crop because they're likely tied up or pushed out by the acids in your soil. Now, the micronutrients you can see on the bottom, iron, manganese, boron, copper, and zinc, and molybdenum, they actually are all more available as the soils become more acidic, but that's not necessarily a good thing because too much of a micronutrient can be detrimental to your crop. So, for the most part, again, the sweet spot here is in that 6.5 to 6.8 range. And some of that has to do with nutrient availability. But pH affects lots of other things as well. pH impacts the biology of the soil. And so earthworms, bacteria, fungi, most of the beneficial organisms that we want in our soil, right? Creating soil structure and tilth and cycling nutrients and organic matter are much less active when the soil pH is low. So acidic soils can be very high in organic matter, which isn't necessarily a good thing. And the reason they can be so high is because the biology does not want to live there and degrade it and cycle it, right, to your crops. So, keeping that pH in the right range is the first and foremost, soil management component for anybody. It's really going to optimize plant productivity, animal health, soil biology, all of those things. So that's the first thing we want to pay attention to. All right, so let's go down to the macronutrients, and we have phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium and sulfur. And I think most people know, actually, let me go back. It says right on the top here, modified Morgan, extractable parts per million. So that's the extractant that I was talking about. I believe Rhode Island uses the same extractant. Maine uses the same extractant. I'm not sure about Massachusetts, but there's Morgans and modified Morgans, and they're used, throughout the Northeast. This soil test is reported in parts per million, and some soil tests are reported in pounds per acre. So you just want to make sure you understand the units and what those mean, but this is in parts per million. And again, the macronutrients are listed for first, and macronutrients, simply means that the crop requires these nutrients and at very high amounts, which we all know that. And then it lists the value right next to it. So the value found here for phosphorus is 3.9 parts per million. For most people, that's meaningless unless you have that table up above. And what you can see from that is 3.9 means it's okay. It's in the medium range. Now, if you look next to the 3.9, it says 4 to 7 parts per million. That's the optimum range, right? So that's when you would be in that optimum level. So fairly straightforward, and most states have interpretation guides and optimum ranges. And so you need to check in with the soil test lab that you're using for your state, okay? All right, so then you can see potassium has a range and magnesium. Calcium doesn't really, we really look at calcium through the lens of soil pH. And you can see in this soil, it's actually pretty high. And we don't really consider that detrimental necessarily. Usually if it's too low, that's when we start realizing that we need to raise the soil pH. All right, so sulfur, magnesium and sulfur, a lot of people don't pay attention to magnesium. It's very important, especially for livestock health and soil management and pasture management. If anybody's ever dealt with grass tetany, that is, not enough magnesium and too much potassium, very common in the spring. And we'll talk about that more in our next session. So if magnesium is low, you need to add it. It's not just saying you need it. If it actually calls it out, you really need to add it. It can cause a lot of herd health issues. Sulfur itself, if you're on fields that are very light textured, so sandy soils that are not getting regular manure additions, organic matter additions, you may need to add sulfur because it leaches very easily. So you'll need to look out for that. And some labs give recommendations. I do also at UVM, given those specific scenarios. Usually in our livestock systems, generally if there's a good amount of manure being added, I don't worry about it too much. Then we have some micronutrients listed here. And again, these are all required Okay, it's not optional, but they're only needed in very, very small amounts. So we don't want to overdo this. We're talking a pound, a half a pound, maybe 2 or 4 pounds an acre, not very much. And again, in most cases, with the exception of a few nutrients like boron, zinc, and sometimes molybdenum, which isn't even listed here, we may need to add micronutrients. Again, light textured soils, low organic matter additions, or low manure additions, we can see deficiencies. Okay, then we list sodium and aluminum. Aluminum in particular in our region is an important nutrient that we look at here. A lot of other places, especially out in the Midwest, they don't even report aluminum, but we do in the Northeast because we tend to have soils that are high in aluminum, which is just a reflection of their genetic background, how they were developed. And aluminum is an acid. So if you have really high, and it's a strong acid, so if you have really high aluminum soils, you may also have very low pH because aluminum is an acid and it's a very strong acid. So it tends to outcompete the bases. Okay. All right. So we will look at aluminum as well. Soil organic matter here is really pretty low. It's 3.3%. The average organic matter really in Vermont anyway is, between 4.5 and 5.5. So a value of 3 is relatively low. So that's telling me that possibly there's a lot of tillage here, or possibly maybe it's a light textured soil. But who knows, right? It's something we'd have to check in with the farmer about. The next thing on our list is the effective CEC, which is the cation exchange capacity. Okay, that's the ability for cations to move on and off of the soil colloids. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute here. The cation exchange capacity, most soil tests report this, not all of them, really in most soils should be between 10 and 12 milliequivalents per 100 gram. If it's much higher than 12, that generally means that those soils are high in clay. When you start to see CECs of 20, 25, 30, my assumption at that point is that there's a lot of clay in the soil, okay? Because clay has negative charge. Okay? So we'll talk about that more in a second. And I'm almost out of time. So the negative charge on the soil holds on to cations. And the cations in your soil, just go to my picture here, are positively charged nutrients. Okay. And the cations also include bases and acids. So I'll just explain this, Rachel, and then we can go to the breakout sessions. So cations, positively charged nutrients, magnesium, hydrogen, which is an acid, ammonium, sodium, potassium, aluminum, which is an acid, and calcium are all cations. So they have a positive charge. Your soil, if it has clay or it has organic matter, older organic matter, okay, has negative charge. So the negative charge on organic matter or clay will hold on to these positively charged nutrients. That is the cation exchange capacity, okay? The ability for your soil to hold on to positively charged nutrients. Okay, so the more positively charged bases, magnesium, calcium, potassium, ammonium, the higher the pH will be. Okay? The more aluminum or hydrogen that you have in your soil, okay, the lower your pH will be, because those exchange sites will hold acids instead of the bases, okay? So to get rid of the acids, that aluminum and the hydrogen, you apply calcium or magnesium, right? You apply lime, something we call lime, which most people know, which is calcium carbonate. And when you add calcium carbonate or other liming sources, you will displace the acids with the bases and drive the pH up, okay? So let me just wrap this up so we can go to our breakout sessions and discuss more soil tests. So the cation exchange capacity here is 14, which is very high. And below that, you can see the percent of those negative sites that have bases, okay? Things that make the pH go up: calcium, potassium, and magnesium. And you can see that most of those negative sites have calcium on them, right? And then some of the sites have potassium, but not very much. You can see the range there should be 2 to 7, okay? And it's low, and we see that in the soil test. And magnesium is between 6.5, or is at 6.5. So we have a lot of calcium, and we need to bring up some of the other nutrients, especially potassium. All right, so with that, we'll move to the breakouts. Is that what we do, Rachel?
So take it away, Heather.
Yep, that did go by fast. Okay, so pasture nutrient management. Let's talk about that. Okay, so I often get calls or hear conversations, you know, about, well, if I use better grazing practices, I'll improve my soil fertility. So that is partly true and should definitely be a component of your fertility program, is good grazing management and pasture management, right? Rotationally grazing, not overgrazing, all of those things. But it's not the only thing, right? So if you were observing some of the soil tests and seeing how low they are, then you know that just grazing, and those fields were in pasture, one of them anyway, isn't necessarily going to fix fields that are very, very low in fertility. They certainly might help, but it'll be hard to grow really good forages if you are just missing lots and lots of nutrients. Okay. So grazing management, the cool thing about grazing management, especially for most of the livestock that we work with and how we're handling them, is that 80 to 90% of the nutrients that they're consuming in the forage they're eating is going back on the land in manure nutrients, right? So they're not eating and converting all of those nutrients into meat or milk or wool or, you know, whatever the sort of product is that you're getting from your livestock. Only 10 to 20% of the nutrients they're consuming is being removed, and the rest is going back onto the ground. So clearly, you know, you are getting fertility by grazing animals, okay? This is a really old extension publication that I use and I love it. And I'll send it to you, Rachel, so you have it and can distribute it. But this really just shows different types of livestock, different sizes as well, total manure production per day, and the nutrient content in you know, pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium per day, okay? And this can really just help you calculate pretty simply how many nutrients you're adding to your pastures based on how many days and how many animals are grazing out in your fields.
Oh, excuse me, Heather.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm seeing the soil test and I wonder if you're thinking we see something else.
I am definitely thinking you're seeing something else.
I saw your new presentation, Heather.
You did?
Yeah.
I saw your presentation, Heather, as well.
Is that because I was in the breakout room with her and she was sharing that screen and it didn't catch up?
Okay, I'm gonna try to share again.
No, because I was in the breakout session with her and I got the new one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I see it now. I apologize. I don't know why. I
No,
couldn't
that's fine.
I see it now
I'm
too.
glad you said something.
Thank
'cause I
you.
couldn't, like,
Yeah, I had the same problem.
gone on and finally somebody saw something. Okay, so yeah, this is a great extension publication. It's pretty old. It's out of Oregon actually, and I actually think the 93 version is just a little updated from some even prior version to that. And it's got some worksheets on the back. I just kind of pulled that out so you could see it, but it really does kind of walk you through, you know, how to calculate nutrient production of each nutrient per cow per day. And then if you multiply that by whatever number of days, right, that you have the animals on a pasture, let's say, you can calculate the pounds of nutrients that are being added to the soil. Okay, so there's just a really simple calculation on the bottom where nitrogen, I said there's 100, I kind of use the example above, basically 100 cattle for 2 days, and each cow is excreting 0.59 pounds of nitrogen per day. And that's going to give me 118 pounds total. So the question here then is, well, is that 118 pounds on an acre, or do they spend 2 days? Is that 2 days on 4 acres, right? So you can really figure out on a per acre basis how many nutrients, when the cows are grazing, are they depositing on the fields. Okay. Now, we'll talk about this in the breakout, but one thing to consider here are farms that are only grazing. There's no other feedstuffs that they're eating, right? So essentially they are depositing this, but they're primarily just cycling nutrients around the farm. Okay, there's nothing new coming in. Okay, does that make sense? If you're a grass only operation, no grain, hopefully you're feeding minerals, but let's say no grain, no minerals, no purchased feed, you're cycling nutrients around your farm. There are no new nutrients coming onto the farm. And in fact, right, if 20% is being taken away, you are slowly mining nutrients away from the farm. Okay, so grass only operations need to really pay even more attention to fertility, because there's more going off than there is coming on, right? So this really is showing you, you know, pounds of nitrogen being deposited, but again, you know, you may just be moving that around from field to field and not adding anything back. So if you're already really low in fertility, yes, you're getting 26 pounds of phosphorus, let's say, per acre on, you know, across the season, but you've extracted, you know, let's say 50 pounds in meat and milk, right? And this is where kind of doing whole farm nutrient balances come into play. But you can calculate manure nutrients, and you do get nutrients from the manure, just thinking about how meaningful that is. All right, so other grazing practices that influence, you know, sort of fertility and distribution, you know, it's just thinking about where the animals may go to get shade, or the water is, or whatever, you know, the situation is in the pasture. We know generally if there's shade and water or minerals, something where the cows sort of congregate and might stay for periods of time, we will see higher soil nutrient concentrations, right? So trying to move things around, moving the water tub, things like that can help distribute the nutrients that the cows are bringing onto the field across the whole field. And this was a study done in 2006 where they were just sort of looking at nutrient concentrations in the soils at different distances from shade. And you can see clearly the further you got from the shade, the less nutrients that were being deposited. Okay, and then of course, rotational grazing versus continuous stocking. Again, just distributing those nutrients more evenly around the field is really the point. So you may be getting nutrients, but where are they all going? Is it all going in one spot? And so only, those plants, get the nutrients, or is it being more evenly distributed? So those are things, and stocking rates, etc., are all things that you can manage to distribute nutrients and also bring more onto a field. All right. So as far as adding more fertility to pastures, I think the thing that bothers me most about nutrient management planning in general is that most nutrient management plans don't even include pasture because manure is not mechanically applied, so it's not a requirement. But hopefully if you're in this training, you consider pasture a very critical crop. It is a crop. It requires fertility, nutrients, management. And so making sure you're treating your pastures like all the other crops on your farm is important for success. So if you have pastures that are mostly grass, you can plan on those fields utilizing about 30 pounds of nitrogen, 30 to 50 actually, depending on the field, per ton of dry matter removed. So, in any given year, you could remove, 2, 3, 4, 5 tons of dry matter, depending on, the fertility of the field and how you're managing it. And that needs to be replaced. If you have legumes in the mix, the legumes are producing nitrogen, and some of that will be used to feed grasses. So if you have a diverse pasture that includes legumes, you'll need less nitrogen. Now, how you get that nitrogen and make sure the plants are getting enough is really up to you to decide, if you're a farm, what kind of nutrient sources you have available. Are the animals actually putting enough on? And where else can you get nitrogen from? And in a lot of cases for people, it'll be manure or, other nitrogen fertilizers. Usually we say if there's more than 30% legume, that can supply the majority of the needs of grasses in a field. And what you're seeing in this quadrat is 30%. That's what 30% looks like. So it's actually quite a bit. 30%, if it's, sort of evenly distributed, shouldn't cause bloat or anything like that. But that is kind of the bar that we set. Now, of course, to grow legumes, you've got to have a higher pH, and you have to have plenty of potassium and molybdenum and boron. So if you're looking at a soil test, as many that we saw already, and the pH is low, and the potassium's low, that might explain why you don't have any legumes, right? So really, it's what are you trying to grow, and what does it need to grow, and how are you going to get it there? We've done a bunch of work looking at grass legume mixtures, and we, know that if we mix legumes with grasses at that sort of 30% range, we're going to produce yields very similar to if we were just adding urea, straight nitrogen, to grass. And so just adding those legumes in there, especially if you're organic and you don't want to buy urea fertilizer, plus it costs money, you know, getting legumes out into those fields can help increase productivity. All right. Timing of adding fertility. A lot of people ask this, you know, if it is straight grass and you need more grass and you're limited on fields, you know, adding that in the spring is always good before you put the cows out. Just like when you're cutting hay, I know a lot of people say, well, I have too much to eat in the spring, so maybe you don't want to add it then. It really depends, again, on, you know, your situation, but adding nitrogen very early in the season can give quite a significant yield boost. And maybe you can cut more hay if you have more pasture, right? So those are some of the things you should be thinking about. All right. Soil tests, we already talked about that. That's really key to, you know, learning about the phosphorus and potassium levels in the soil. Phosphorus really, as long as you're keeping the pH up and you have manure on your farm, you should be able to manage to get the phosphorus levels, you know, in optimum without too much trouble. The big thing we worry about, of course, with phosphorus is environmental losses, too much of it. So we need to make sure that we're not over applying it as well. And again, I already talked about managing the pH to make sure phosphorus is available, right? So there's a lot of good reasons why we need to adjust that pH. We can grow better legumes, we can cycle more nitrogen, we can make the nutrients that are there more available to our crops. All of those things. All right. So potassium and grass management, you know, grasses and legumes use a lot of potassium, and many of our soils in the Northeast are potassium deficient. Potassium does leach pretty easily. And so it's really important to manage and make sure that you have, you know, optimum potassium levels. The one kind of dangerous thing about potassium is that plants will luxury consume it, which means there's no kind of shutoff valve. So if you put on lots and lots of potassium at one time to meet the nutrient needs based on the soil test, your plants are going to try to take up as much of that as possible, which means there won't be any left, you know, for the next raise or the next hay cutting, because it'll luxury consume that potassium. So potassium management's important. You know, if you need it, it needs to be added. That's, you know, it's really sort of builds the chlorophyll and the photosynthetic parts of the plant, the leaves in particular, and the stems. So it's really critical, but you have to be careful, because certainly you can underdo it, but you can also overdo it. And I think most people know that too much potassium can cause metabolic issues in your cows. And we'll talk about that if we have time. So split applications are really important if you need a lot of potassium, okay? So if you need a lot of potassium, usually applying it kind of later in the summer is best, and splitting up those applications over time so that you're not putting it all on at once. All right, and then of course liming, we can have some issues when we have very low pH. I kind of talked about this already, and you lime the soil. You can get potassium tied up on the exchange sites, or you can also have it released. So depending on the situation, liming can impact potassium in the soil. So potassium is generally highest in the first graze or first cutting of forage, is what this graph is showing. And some of that has to do, especially in the Northeast, with kind of freeze-thaw cycles and a lot of water and a lot of movement of potassium off from the exchange sites into the soil water. So we tend to have very high potassium levels in the spring, and those drop throughout the season. Potassium, too much potassium will outcompete calcium and magnesium going into your plants, okay? So again, you know, these are things we run into with metabolic issues where you don't have enough, you have too high potassium feed, and so there's not enough magnesium or not enough calcium, and you run into things like grass tetany or milk fever, okay? So we have to manage that as well. So again, this just shows you if your potassium levels are too high, it actually brings down the level of the other nutrients, right? There's a balance in the soil and in the uptake into your plant. So this is something we have to really pay attention to. And that's why I said, if you are low in magnesium and your soils are high in potassium, you need to add that magnesium. And same with calcium, you can cause a lot of metabolic issues in your animals. All right, and that's just what this is showing. All right, and lastly, lime. We already talked about this quite a bit, but you know, really this is your biggest bang for your buck. And I saw something in the chat, I can't see everything because I've got the presentation up, but about the cost of lime. And I know it is going up. There are some other options. You know, people have really gotten into using wood ash as an example that seems to be, has been more available, has been more cost effective for folks. Wood ash is burnt wood. So it's high in calcium, it's high in magnesium, it's high in micronutrients like boron, manganese, and molybdenum. So it can be a really good amendment, especially on forages, to raise the pH and supply micronutrients and potassium. So it is a good option for a lot of people. Now, you want to make sure you lime before the pH gets too low. We already talked about this. You want to take care of these nutrients, all of them, before you get into that low range. Once you're in the low range, it's super expensive to bring those soils back up. And it gets very, very costly. And then it feels unsurmountable for a lot of people. You know, you just don't have the resources. And the longer you let it go, the worse it gets, right? So it's something that you really got to prioritize. You got to prioritize the soil tests, like we talked about before, and where it makes the most sense to invest the money that you have. All right, I think I'm on time this time.
Thanks, Heather. So you are very much on time. You did cover a lot of what was asked for questions. There was somebody asking about soil compaction, and Kirsten so nicely answered provided some good information in the chat about that. There was a question about lime. Does anybody else have any other questions before we jump into our next breakout session?
Yeah.
While everyone's doing that, I will also mention that this webinar wraps up our winter webinar series. We're transitioning into planning for our field workshops, where we'll start applying some of the concepts that we've talked about here in our series out in the field. And I'm excited to share with everybody that we are welcoming Heather for one of our 2 field workshops this upcoming summer. The date has not been finalized, but we're thinking end of June, sometime in that time frame. We'll be at a farm up in northern Massachusetts, so more details on that to follow. We will have a second one. I'm still in the process of planning that one out. That location is still undetermined at the moment, but when I have more details, I will certainly make sure we share those and send all of those along to everybody. Unless anybody else had any questions or any other thoughts that they wanted to share, please feel free to do that now. And otherwise, thank you for joining us today. I hope that it was a productive couple hours for you. And again, Heather, thank you very much for being our speaker today and to all of our moderators who were in the breakout sessions leading all of our groups. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.